In the autumn of 1887, on a treeless headland above Gray's Harbor in the Washington Territory, a young woman paid $3 for a lighthouse nobody wanted. That sum bought her a structure the Territorial Revenue Service had condemned the previous spring, a tower of wind-scoured shingle and mortared rubite stone, 41 feet from base to the cracked glass of its lantern room, standing on a wedge of public coastal land that the government had surveyed, and then, as governments sometimes do, quietly forgotten. The revenue men had posted the notice in the Westport Trading Post, then in Aberdeen, then in a column of faded ink in the Gray's Harbor Gazette. No one attended the auction. The auctioneer, a small man named Birch who smelled of pipe tobacco and impatience, had lowered the opening bid 3 times over the course of 20 minutes before the woman at the back of the room raised her hand. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 27 years old, spare and weathered in the way that coastal women become when they spend their days reading the horizon rather than the parlor. She had come to the Harbor County 3 months prior from the Columbia River Survey Office in Portland, where she had held a position as a cartographic tracer and had been, by the assessment of anyone willing to say so plainly, the most accurate hand in the office. She could trace a survey line freehand at 1 to 5,000 scale and hold it within a hair of the original. She could read a set of field notes and find the inconsistency that the draftsman had missed and the surveyor had not wanted found. These were skills that made her useful and eventually inconvenient. The office director, a man named Galt, who held convictions about the proper employment of women in public service, had dismissed her the previous June with 2 weeks of wages and a reference she had not asked for. The reference noted her technical competence and made no mention of the reason for her departure, which Clara understood to be standard. She had taken the coastal steamer north with $61 remaining after 3 months of lodging at a widow's house above the oyster beds and her Uncle Silas's surveying kit in the oilskin satchel that sat at her feet on the deck railing. The satchel held a cedar-handled protractor, 2 sighting levels, a plumb bob, a folding scale rule, a box of drafting nibs, and 2 rolls of linen tracing cloth. Silas had carried these instruments for 30 years on the Columbia and on the survey boats of the lower coast, and he had left them to Clara when he died, because he had written in the letter accompanying his will. She was the only person he had trained who used them for what they were made for, rather than for what someone else wanted them to show. Clara had read that letter twice, and then folded it into the satchel with the instruments and kept it there. She raised her hand at Birch's auction, and he brought down his gavel without quite believing it. And for $3, Clara Voss owned a lighthouse. If you have ever stood before a thing the world has thrown away and felt, not a warning, but a question, stay with this story. It is the account of what she found there, and what it had been hiding for 28 years. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1884 after the new federal light at the harbor mouth was completed, a taller structure with a Fresnel lens that threw a beam 8 miles into the Pacific. The old tower had served the coast since 1859, built by a contractor named Aldous Marsh for the Lighthouse Board on a modest appropriation that, as the surviving records indicated, had not been fully spent. Marsh had taken the remainder in materials and labor adjustments, which was the custom of the era and not strictly irregular, and had built the lighthouse to the specifications in his contract and no further. It sat on a wedge of basalt-capped clay that jutted 50 feet above the tide line, accessible by a dirt track that turned to standing water after any rainfall. The lantern room glass was cracked in 2 panes. The oil room below it was empty, its copper fittings stripped for salvage. The iron door to the main chamber had rusted solid in its frame. Clara had known about the lighthouse for 2 weeks before the auction. She had found it while running survey lines along the headland for her own purposes. mapping the harbor approaches as a way of staying in practice, and because the work steadied her when other things did not. The harbor county was not her destination, but had become her situation, and she had learned from her uncle that the most reliable antidote to a changed situation was methodical work. She had spent her mornings on the headland with the sighting levels, running traverses and recording the coastal geometry in her field notebook, and one of those mornings had brought her within sight of the tower's wind-bleached shingle and the rusted door glinting in the low harbor light. She'd walked its perimeter. She had paced the base of the tower, noting the construction, examining the mortar courses where the rubite stone met the basalt foundation. She had looked at the structure as Silas had taught her to look at any constructed thing, as a record of decisions, of materials, of the intentions written into the dimensions whether the builder intended to write them or not. She had been a cartographic tracer for 7 years and had spent a portion of those years learning to read the mathematics behind the drawings. A survey was an argument, a claim that the world was a certain shape at a certain moment, and the claim was only as reliable as the man who made it. Silas had taught her to verify the claim against the geometry, to check the field notes against the final plat, to find the place where the measurement and the drawing diverged, because that divergence was the truth the document was trying to hide. She was not thinking about divergence when she first paced the lighthouse. She was thinking about the construction and noting, as she paced, that the tower looked smaller on the inside than on the outside, which was a thing she had been taught to notice. She did the calculation in her field notebook before she walked back to Westport that morning. The tower's outer diameter measured 24 feet, the wall thickness specified in the Lighthouse board contract, which she had read in the auction notice because she read the supporting documentation of anything she was considering, was 24 inches, standard for a coastal tower of that height. An outer diameter of 24 feet less, 2 walls of 24 inches, should yield an interior diameter of 20 feet. She had paced the interior through the broken oil room window and estimated it at 18 feet. 2 feet, roughly, unaccounted for. 2 feet specifically in the north quadrant, which faced away from the harbor approach and toward the open coast. She had paced the outer north face 3 times and the inner north arc twice. The numbers were consistent. The wall in the north quadrant was approximately 12 inches thicker than specified. She did not know yet what that meant. She knew what it felt like to find an inconsistency in a constructed record. It felt like the same small pressure she had felt in the cartographic office on the afternoon she had found the divergence in the Columbia River depth survey that had eventually ended her employment. A quiet insistence in the arithmetic that said something here does not account for itself. She raised her hand at the auction for $3 and owned the lighthouse, and then she went to work. The iron door took 2 days to open. She borrowed a pry bar from the widow's husband and purchased a cold chisel and a 4-pound maul from the hardware merchant in Westport, paying 70 cents for both. The hinge pins had rusted into their sleeves, and she drove them out from below, working upward through each sleeve with the cold chisel, while the October wind came off the harbor and the gulls turned in wide arcs over the headland. She worked in the mornings when the wind dropped and the light was best, chiseling with measured strokes, not forcing, letting the metal give it its own rate. Silas had taught her that a rusted fastener driven hard will shear, and a sheared pin is a problem that takes all day where a patient pin takes an hour. On the second afternoon, the last pin came free with a sound like a struck bell, and the door swung outward on its lower hinge, sheeting rust dust across the basalt threshold, and the smell that came out was old stone and sea damp, and underneath both of those, a dryness that did not belong to a salt air structure, the smell of sealed space, the smell of a room that had not breathed in a long time. She brought her whale oil lantern inside and held it to the north quadrant wall, and moved it slowly along the mortar lines. The interior of the lower chamber was 8 feet across and 12 feet high, the walls of mortared rubite stone in courses that ran roughly level, the floor of poured concrete that had cracked along a diagonal seam from the door to the base of the iron ladder. A chain hung from the ladder rail. A rusted hook remained in the wall above where the oil casks had been stored. The space smelled of long stillness, of water that had never quite reached the interior, and of something beneath that, the faint mineral sharpness of old lime mortar cooling. Clara held the lantern close to the north wall and read the mortar. The mortar in the north quadrant was newer than the surrounding courses. Not obviously so. Someone had taken considerable pains to approximate the color of the original mix, working a gray-brown aggregate into the lime that was close, at a glance, to the weathered original. But close was not the same as matching, and Clara's eye, trained across 7 years of tracing lines that other hands had drawn, was not an eye that accepted close. The color was off by perhaps 1 shade. The texture was finer, and the mortar lines were fractionally narrower than the surrounding courses, the work of someone who had mixed his material with more care for appearance than for binding strength. A mason's eye would have caught it. A casual inspection would not. She set the lantern on the floor and placed both palms against the north wall. The stone was cold. And then, far back behind the cold, she felt what she had been listening for since she first paced the outer wall, the faintest movement of air, a pressure differential, the breath of an interior space that had been sealed long enough to develop its own still climate behind a wall built to look like no wall at all. She stood in the dark of the lower chamber with her palms against the stone and listened to the lighthouse breathe. And then she picked up the lantern and walked back to Westport to buy what she would need. The mason's supplies came to $1.40. She bought a pointing chisel, a bolster chisel, 2 pounds of hydraulic lime for the restoration mortar, and a 50-page paper journal in which she began that evening to record what she intended to do and what she found as she did it. The first entry she made that evening began with the north wall. False course beginning at floor level, running approximately 40 inches east to west to an estimated height of 5 feet. Mortar newer by at least 10 years than surrounding work. Interior void apparent from air pressure differential. Proceed systematically. Do not conclude before the evidence is complete. That last line was her uncle's instruction, carried verbatim from 30 years of survey work. Do not conclude before the evidence is complete. She had seen what happened when men did otherwise, and she had borne a portion of the cost of one such occasion. The mortar in the false course took 4 days to clear. She worked 1 course at a time from the floor upward, the pointing chisel working the joints while she collected the broken mortar in a canvas bucket and carried it outside in loads so that no debris fell into the void beneath the upper courses. The work was slow and precise, and her wrists ached by the second morning, the repetitive striking wearing into the small tendons along the heel of her hand. She wore her uncle's canvas work gloves, which were too large for her and had holes at the first 2 fingers of the right hand, through which the mortar dust worked and caked against her skin. She rinsed her hands in the cold water of the headland, seep each evening and wrapped the right hand in a strip of canvas before she slept. She did not rush. The false wall had stood for 28 years. It would stand another 4 days while she opened it correctly. On the morning of the 3rd day, she cleared the mortar from a course at knee height and pressed her fingers into the joint and felt nothing below and nothing above. Standard stone. And then at the far right end of the course, where the false wall met the adjacent original stonework at a vertical seam she had been careful not to disturb, she felt a current of air. She held her fingers there. The air moved against them with an absolute steadiness, the slow exhalation of a sealed space large enough to have accumulated pressure, not the random draft of a windcrack, a continuous and deliberate movement. The void was real, and it was larger than she had estimated from the outside. She kept working. The next morning, she cleared the upper courses of the false wall, stone by stone. Each stone lifted free once its mortar joints had been fully opened on all four sides. Each stone set outside on the basalt in the sequence of its removal so that she knew exactly where it had come from. Some of the stones were heavier than she had expected, the rubite being a dense coastal stone, and she set them with both hands and felt the weight in her shoulders afterward. On the afternoon of the fourth day, she pulled the seventh stone from the second highest course and set it down and looked through the opening at what was inside. The cavity was not large, but it was deliberate. It ran approximately 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and just over 5 feet high. The dimensions of a narrow closet lined on 3 sides by the original rubite of the tower wall, and on the fourth by the false courses she had just dismantled. The floor of the cavity was a single poured concrete slab, raised 3 inches above the chamber floor, which had kept it dry even through the coastal wet of 28 winters. The air that came out when the last stone was removed was cool and absolutely still, the kind of stillness that belongs to a space that has been closed against the weather for decades. On the floor of the cavity, resting on 2 wooden battens to keep it off the concrete, was a flat oilskin packet, approximately 14 inches by 18 inches, tied with a linen cord that had dried to something close to wire. On the wall of the cavity, pinned through the oilskin backing into the mortar between 2 stone courses at eye height, was a chart. Clara stood at the opening and looked at the chart for a long time before she touched anything. She had read hundreds of charts in the cartographic office. She understood their conventions the way a person who has read a great deal of music comes to understand notation, not as a code to be translated, but as a language she thought in. She knew the difference between an Admiralty survey and a Revenue Service coastal chart and a private commercial chart made for a specific route. She knew how a measured coastline looked and how an approximated one looked and how an invented one looked. The differences were in the sounding spacing, in the confidence of the depth contour lines, in the notation style for shoals and bars, in the way headlands were drawn when someone had stood beneath them and taken angles, and when someone had merely drawn their best guess of the shape from a distance. The chart pinned to the false wall was not guessed. It was measured. It depicted a coastline she had never seen on any published chart, a coast running roughly north to south, with a deep natural harbor at its center, protected on 2 sides by substantial headlands, shoaled at its entrance by a submerged bar that the chart showed in careful detail with sounding marks spaced at regular intervals. There were anchorage marks inside the harbor, 4 of them with depth figures ranging from 6 fathoms to 9. There was a channel line running from the outer approach through the bar, with the deepest passage marked with a dotted course line and bearing notations for entering from the northwest. There was a small inset in the upper right corner of the chart showing the harbor entrance as it appeared from seaward, the 2 headlands framing the gap with a small navigation triangle showing the angles that confirmed the entrance. The chart was drawn on linen drafting paper, the heavy professional grade that commercial cartographers used when they expected their work to last. The line work was steady, and the notation was in a hand she did not know, a compact technical hand with a slight rightward lean. The blue wash of the depth contours had kept its color. The soundings were marked in fathoms, which was the pre-federal convention. This coast appeared on no government survey she'd ever traced or read. It appeared on no commercial chart she'd seen in the Portland office. It was, as far as the public record was concerned, a coast that did not exist. but someone had gone there and measured it. She took the chart down carefully, removing each tack with her pointing chisel, and then she untied the oilskin packet and carried both outside into the late afternoon light, where she spread the packet's contents on the basalt threshold and weighed the corners with stones and read. There were 7 pages. The first 3 were copies of correspondence between Aldous Marsh and an entity identified in the salutation only as the Pacific Mercantile Combine, dated between the spring of 1858 and the fall of 1861. The letters described a harbor in the language of commercial speculation, noting its depth relative to the existing ports of the territory, its shelter from the prevailing swell, the quality of its holding ground, its distance from the established trade routes. They described the value of a private channel chart known only to the Combine's captains, a chart that would give the Combine's vessels exclusive access to an anchorage that no other operator could find, a harbor that appeared on no government survey and no published coastal atlas. Marsh's letters described the sum he required for the survey and for his discretion. The Combine's replies were formal and administrative, the language of commerce rather than conspiracy. But the meaning was plain. The harbor was to be surveyed. The chart was to be delivered. No copies were to be kept in any public record. The 4th page was a deed of private claim, drawn by a San Francisco attorney, by which Aldous Marsh conveyed to the Pacific Mercantile Combine his claim to a strip of coastal land encompassing the harbor and its immediate approaches. The deed was dated November 1860 and bore Marsh's signature and the signature of 2 witnesses Clara did not recognize. The 5th and 6th pages were Marsh's survey field notes, the raw numbers from which the chart had been made, columns of compass bearings and chain distances and lead-line depth readings recorded in the same compact hand as the chart notation, the work of someone who had gone out in a small boat and measured the harbor approach and the channel, and the anchorage, and the headland geometry with the instruments available to him in 1858, and who had done it with professional thoroughness. The numbers were consistent across the 2 days of his survey. He had checked his work. The 7th page was a letter in a different hand, dated October 1861, addressed to Marsh from a man who signed himself as Pellaway and identified himself as the Combine's principal director in San Francisco. The letter acknowledged receipt of the completed chart and the deed copy, confirmed that the agreed sum had been forwarded, and then, in 2 sentences that became more careful than the rest, noted that the harbor fell within a coastal reserve established by the federal government under the Oregon Territorial Survey Act of 1857, a reserve on which no private commercial claim was possible without an act of Congress that had not been sought and was not contemplated. The letter noted that the Combine understood this circumstance and that Marsh should consider the agreement concluded on both sides. What Pellaway's letter told Clara, reading it on the basalt threshold in the October afternoon light with the harbor below her and the Pacific beyond it, was that the Combine had known all along. They had paid Marsh to survey a harbor on protected federal land, knowing the private claim was legally void, knowing the deed would never be registered because registration would expose the violation. They had not wanted the land. They had wanted the chart. A navigational secret known only to the Combine's captains, giving them access to a harbor no competitor could find, was worth the price of a survey and a sealed wall. The private deed was not the point of the arrangement. The suppression of the chart was the point, and the suppression had held. For 28 years, no government surveyor and no commercial cartographer had included the harbor in any published document. The coast it served was officially a coast that did not exist. Clara thought about who had been harmed by that official non-existence. Before she walked to Aberdeen, she spent 4 days on the water. She needed to verify the chart herself. This was not something she could have explained easily to someone who had not spent years in the discipline. The documents were real, and the field notes were professionally made, and the chart was drawn with evident care. These things she knew, but a surveyor does not confirm evidence by reading it. A surveyor confirms evidence by repeating the measurement and seeing whether the result agrees. She had been taught this so thoroughly and for so long that it had ceased to feel like a rule, and had become simply how she understood truth to work. She borrowed a rowboat from the Westport cannery operator, a taciturn Finn named Hedges, who wanted $4 a week for its use, and got 2 3/4 when Clara told him she would document the condition of his dock pilings while she worked the harbor, a service he accepted since the revenue inspector was due in the spring, and the pilings were a matter of some concern to him. She did not take Marsh's chart in the boat. She took her own field notebook and her lead line, a 30-foot cord she had marked in the old fathom notation with knotted leather tabs, 3 tabs for the shallow depths, and cloth tabs in alternating colors for the deeper soundings. She had rigged the line from a spool of linen cord she purchased from the dry goods merchant, and weighted it with a 1-pound plumb bob from her kit. She rode the harbor approach at low water, beginning before dawn each morning when the tide was dropping and the readings were most reliable. The approach from the northwest was exactly as Marsh's chart showed it, the bar visible as a pale gray-green smear beneath the surface when the sun was high enough to penetrate. She worked along the bar first, dropping the lead every 30 feet, and reading the depth against the marked cord, calling the numbers aloud, and writing them into the notebook while the rowboat rocked in the small Pacific swell that found its way over the bar's crest. The depth over the bar ranged from 11 to 14 feet at mean low water, consistent with Marsh's soundings from 1858 within 1 to 2 feet, a discrepancy she attributed to 30 years of silting in the shallower sections. The channel through the bar was essentially unchanged. Marsh had found the deepest passage at the western end of the bar, where the tidal current kept the bottom scoured, and Clara found it there too, 18 feet of water at low tide, deep enough for any vessel trading on the Pacific coast in the current era. She rode the channel 3 times, once to establish its location and twice more to confirm. The readings agreed. Inside the bar, the harbor opened into the wide protected anchorage the chart showed, the headlands curving inward on both sides, the bottom dropping to 6 fathoms and then to 9 in the deepest section near the northern headland. Clara worked the anchorage for 2 mornings, running depth transects from east to west and recording the results, letting the lead settle fully before reading and pulling it clear before the tidal current could drag the line. The holding ground was gravel and fine sand, good holding for any anchor. On the 4th morning, she rode the inner face of the northern headland and found the fresh water seep that Marsh's notes had described in a parenthetical beside the anchorage depths, a notation she had not quite credited until she found the green-black staining on the rock face at the waterline where the seep emerged in a thin, cold thread and ran down the basalt into the harbor. A fresh water source inside a sheltered anchorage was a practical detail that argued powerfully for the harbor's commercial value. Marsh had noted it. She noted it. The harbor was exactly what the chart claimed. She rowed back to Westport, returned the boat to Hedges, and wrote her harbor soundings into the field notebook alongside Marsh's numbers. The agreement between the 2 surveys, separated by 30 years, was close enough that she was satisfied. The coast that appeared on no chart was real, and it was navigable, and it was, as the Combine's correspondents had correctly identified, in 1858, one of the more significant natural anchorages on the Washington Territory coast north of the Columbia. She walked to Aberdeen the following morning, 4 miles on the coast road in a cold wind, and spent the afternoon in the Territorial Land Office reading the Federal Reserve records for the Grays Harbor District. She presented herself to the clerk as a private surveyor, which was accurate, and asked to see the 1857 Reserve Boundary Survey and its administrative history. The clerk, a young man named Duval, was thorough and asked no particular questions, which Clara appreciated. The Reserve Boundary Survey was incomplete. It had been certified incomplete in 1869, when the Lighthouse Board had requested a final plat for a proposed improvement project, and the district surveyor's office had discovered that the coastal boundary in the southern portion of the reserve had never been fully run. The record noted the incompleteness and flagged the survey for completion. No completion had been filed in the 18 years since. The incompleteness was not an accident. The harbor that Marsh had surveyed and suppressed was the most significant geographic feature in the southern portion of the reserve. Without the harbor survey, the coastal boundary could not be accurately drawn. Without the accurate boundary, the reserve's extent was legally uncertain in exactly the area where the harbor lay. Duval also produced, at Clara's request, the record of homestead applications made for land within or adjacent to the reserve since 1857. There were 4 denials. The third was dated 1879. The applicant was named Gideon Cale. He had applied to homestead 40 acres of coastal land, abutting the reserve on its northern margin, and he had been denied on the grounds that the adjacent reserve boundary survey was incomplete, and the boundary therefore uncertain. He had appealed in 1881 and been denied again on the same grounds. Clara wrote the name and the address of record in her journal. The address was a general store in a settlement called Grannis, 12 miles south along the coast road. She rode to Grannis the next morning on a horse she hired from the Westport livery for 50 cents. Nell Cale was 32 years old and ran the general store that her father had managed before his death in the winter of 1883. She was sorting a crate of freight invoices when Clara came in, and she looked up with the mild attentiveness of a person who does not waste a first glance. The store smelled of beeswax and coffee, and the particular dry wood smell of a building that has been kept clean for a long time by someone who considers cleanliness a form of respect rather than a chore. Clara set her field journal on the counter and told Nell what she had found in the lighthouse wall. She told it plainly and in order, beginning with the arithmetic and the paste circumferences, and ending with the 7 documents in the oilskin packet. She did not editorialize. She was not in the habit of editorializing. The record was the argument. She had only to state it. Nell listened without interrupting. When Clara reached the 7th page, the Pellaway letter, Nell looked out the store window at the coast road and was quiet for a moment. "My father believed the boundary line was false," she said. "He said so to the land office, and he said it to anyone who would listen, and after some years, no one would." "He was not wrong," Clara said. "The boundary was certified incomplete because the harbor survey was missing from the reserve record. The harbor survey was missing because Marsh sealed it in the lighthouse wall in 1861, and it remained there until last week. The combine filed no deed in the land office. No deed was ever registered. The combine is dissolved. Its San Francisco Records office closed in 1874. There is no living party to the private claim, and the claim was never enforceable in any event because the land was Federal Reserve land. What Marsh and Pellaway managed was not the acquisition of the land, but the suppression of the knowledge that the harbor existed. As long as the harbor appeared on no chart and in no survey, the reserve boundary remained uncertain, and your father's application had no ground to stand on." Nell looked at the journal on the counter between them. She looked at it for a long time. "The 40 acres," she said quietly, "were never legally alienated from homestead availability," Clara said. "The denial of your father's application rested entirely on the incomplete boundary survey. The survey can now be completed. A completed boundary plat, incorporating the harbor survey, would be the basis for reinstating the application." There is a particular silence that comes after a long wrong has been named aloud. It is not the silence of surprise, but of recognition. The silence of a thing that has been wrong for so long that the wrongness has become part of the weather. And then someone stands in the room and names it, and for a moment the weather changes, and the silence is the sound of that change. Nell stood behind the counter of her father's store, and that silence gathered around her, and Clara stood on the other side of it and let it gather. "Your father's field notes in the application file," Clara said after a moment. "Did he have a surveyor run the 40-acre boundaries?" "He ran them himself," Nell said. "He had a transit and a chain. He was careful. The notes are in the land office file. I would need to check them against the reserve boundary I will draw. But if his work was careful, the reinstatement plat should be straightforward." Nell looked at Clara. "Why are you doing this?" It was a reasonable question. Clara considered it for a moment before answering. "Because the arithmetic led here," she said. "Because a suppressed survey harmed a specific person whose name I found in a file. Because the work is not finished until what was hidden has been placed where the record can find it." She did not add that she had spent 7 years in a cartographic office, watching records be drawn to serve the purposes of the men who commissioned them, and that she had been dismissed for noting where the record and the truth diverged. She did not need to add it. The logic of the work spoke clearly enough for anyone listening. The filing took the better part of 3 months. Clara engaged a territorial land attorney named Partridge, whose office was in Aberdeen and whose fees she negotiated in exchange for the survey work she provided to complete the coastal boundary. She ran the traverse lines herself, working along the reserve margin through November and into December, when the harbor rain came sideways off the Pacific and the basalt headlands went dark and wet. She wore her uncle's canvas coat over her shawl and kept the instruments dry under oilskin wraps. The survey ran 15 days of field work and 4 days of drafting at the Lighthouse, where she had rigged a drawing board from a plank and 2 sawhorses in the lower chamber, and where the whale oil lantern gave enough light to work the evening hours. She produced a plat of the harbor and its approaches that extended and completed the 1857 Reserve Boundary Survey, incorporating Marsh's original field notes, her own traverse data, and the harbor soundings she had run herself in the borrowed rowboat in October. The harbor did not require renaming. It was named in no published document. She gave it its coordinates and its boundary description and its anchorage depth figures, and filed it as a completion plat, which was what it was. Partridge filed the completed survey with the Federal District Land Office in late November, and the reinstatement petition for Gideon Cale's homestead application in early December. The original Marsh chart and the 7 documents from the oilskin packet went into the Federal District Surveyor's Archive as evidentiary annexes, indexed in the Bound Register under the Reserve Survey Completion Docket. They were placed in a pasteboard box labeled in the clerk's hand, shelved in the row of boxes that held the completed coastal surveys of the Grays Harbor District. Aldous Marsh had been dead since 1878. The Pacific Mercantile Combine had been dissolved for 13 years. Whether anyone would pursue the commercial implications of the Pellaway letter was a matter for the district attorney's office and for federal investigators whose authority and interest Clara did not presume to predict. She had noted the questions in her journal and then set them down, because they were not hers to answer. She had found what the wall held. She had placed it where the record could see it. The law would do what the law did. The homestead patent for Gideon Cale's 40 acres was approved in the spring of 1888 and issued in June. Nell rode up to the Lighthouse on a clear June morning to tell her, arriving in the early afternoon when the harbor light lay flat and bright off the water below the headland. She tied her horse to the rusted iron ring at the base of the lighthouse doorframe and brought a bottle of cider and 2 glasses. Clara was at the drawing board when she heard the horse, and she came down the iron ladder and out through the door that now opened and closed freely on its reset hinges. They sat on the basalt threshold in the sun, which had some warmth to it for the first time since October, and Nell poured the cider. Partridge said the plat was the finest coastal survey work filed in the district in 20 years, Nell said. His words, not mine. Your father's field notes were excellent, Clara said. His transit work was better than Marsh's. The 40-acre lines are accurate to within 2 chains. He would have liked to know that. They sat for a while and let that thought settle. The harbor below was still in the windless June noon, and the smell coming up from the water was salt and pine, and the faint mineral sharpness of low tide, the same smell as the coast that appeared on no chart until she had placed it there. What will you do with it? Nell asked. She meant the lighthouse. Clara considered the question. The Revenue Service had never asked for the $3 back, and Partridge had confirmed that the condemned structure remained in private title. The tower was hers, clear and quiet. I have not decided, she said. I have been offered a position with the district surveyor's office in Aberdeen, completing the coastal survey of the Northern Reserve section, which has the same incompleteness problem as the southern section. Will you take it? I am considering it. Clara turned the cider glass in her hands. I do not know yet whether the district surveyor understands what he is offering, or whether he merely needs accurate work done and is willing to overlook the usual objections in order to get it. One way to find out, Nell said. One way, Clara agreed. Below the headland, a vessel was making the harbor mouth, running south before the early summer swell, its hull dark against the gray-green water. Clara watched it find the channel and slow as the swell diminished behind the northern headland, and she thought about the chart that was now in the Federal Archive in Aberdeen, the harbor that had been secret for 28 years and was no longer secret, its soundings and its channel line and its anchorage marks available to any navigator who came to the district surveyor's office and asked to see the coastal survey of the Grays Harbor Reserve. A coast that had not existed because no chart showed it. A coast that now existed because the right hand had found what the wall held. She set down her glass and picked up the cedar-handled protractor from where it lay on the threshold, where she had set it when she came down from the drawing board. She turned it in her hands, the wood smooth and warm from the sun. The brass pivot at its center was dark with years of use, the brass of the scale arc worn to a deep warm brown, where her uncle's thumb had rested against it for 30 years, and where her thumb rested now. She had used it to draw the harbor chart, to trace Marsh's field notes into the new plat, to run the traverse lines along the reserve margin in the November rain. It had not bent or slipped or failed her. Silas had given it to her because she used tools for what they were made for. She intended to keep doing so. Below the headland, the vessel had found its anchorage in the harbor that the chart now showed. It was a small working schooner, rigged for coastal freight, riding easily in the deep water behind the protecting headlands, its anchor chain angled down into 6 fathoms of clear holding ground, exactly where Marsh's survey had marked them, and where her own lead line had confirmed the depth. Someone on board had read the new plat, or had spoken to a navigator who had, and had come here because the chart now showed the way. Nell refilled the glasses, and they sat in the June sun on the threshold of the lighthouse that had held the secret, and the sea moved below them in its old, unhurried way, and the schooner rode at its anchor in the harbor that no longer belonged to the silence. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below. There are others like it here, and they are waiting.